Welcome to the first webinar of the Erasmus Plus Lead Future project, Lead Future to Change the Future, which we are developing in collaboration with the University of Murcia, Salerno, Bonn, Leuven, Stockholm, and the Juan de la Cierva Secondary School in the region of Murcia. We are very grateful for your attendance and the positive response we received to this activity. The Lead Future project aims to contribute to the social debates at the university level, making the activities we offer free and accessible to our students, the educational communities of our schools and universities, and society at large. This is the purpose of activities like today's, an event that kicks off a series of webinars that we will develop at different universities, focusing on eco-criticism, ecological thoughts, and other topics related to sociology and literary studies. This first seminar is co-organized by University of Salerno and the University of Murcia and features Binghamton University professor Jason Moore as a speaker. It is a pleasure to begin today's session by giving the floor to Gennaro Avallone, coordinator of the Lead Future project at the University of Salerno. Thank you very much, Gennaro. It's all yours.
Okay, Jason, the other participants, I have some other introductory notes for this webinar titled Capitalist World Ecology, Theory and Method and Real Ground of History. The main goal of this webinar is, as shared with Jason Moore, is to introduce the world ecology approach, or as Jason likes to say, conversation, world ecology conversation, in order to better understand its key, or a part of its key categories and interpretations, capitalist history and its current crisis, understood in the world ecology approach as a civilizational crisis. Jason Moore is an environmental historian and historical geographer at Binghamton University, where he coordinates the World Ecology Research Collective. He's the author of several books, particularly the Capitalism in the Web of Life and other books translated in several languages, also in Spanish, El Capitalismo es la trama de la vida, and in Italian we have other books. The last is Beyond the Climate Justice, oltre la giustizia climatica, in Italian. Participants in the webinar are invited to submit their questions and comments in the Zoom chat for organizational reasons. After Jason's talk, we feel to read the commentaries on the questions, so that Jason can respond, and we can talk, we can speak about Jason communication. And now, after my brief introduction, I'll hand the floor over to Jason for his seminar. Many thanks to Jason, of course, and all people that participate in our webinar. Thanks, Jason.
Thank you. Let me begin the PowerPoint so that we can, let's see if it will cooperate with me. Here we are. Thank you. What an honor it is to be in conversation with everyone today. When I was invited, I had in mind an audience of postgraduates, but don't worry, I will do my best to be clear and as accessible as possible throughout. World ecology is, let me see if I can fix this here. World ecology is, above all, a conversation about the necessary intellectual and therefore political syntheses that are necessary for a revolutionary and democratic transformation of the world in the 21st century. And I think that we can begin to make sense of the core political and intellectual agenda of the world ecology conversation by returning to Marx and Engels, not as a matter of orthodoxy, not as a matter of dogma. Marx and Engels did not come down from the mountain with their truths etched onto stone tablets. However, these are very much live and generative ways of thinking that I fear have often been ignored or minimized by eco-socialist thought. This is a fundamental issue in intellectual life. All of our formulations are necessarily one-sided, as Marx and Engels said. That does not need to be reduced to academic point scoring. It can be a moment of generative and comradely synthesis, as all the great revolutionaries of the 20th century understood: Lenin, Mao, Castro, and many others. So world ecology is above all a method in this specific sense. It is a question of bounding socio-ecological phenomena. It is a rejection of causal pluralism in favor of a unified explanation of historical change as a rich totality of many determinations. That's Marx from the Grundrisse. The causal pluralism of mainstream and also critical approaches has to be rejected in favor of a dialectical approach to mediation. Mediation is fundamental. Marxists, of course, recognize that historical change is diverse. What matters is how those different moments are interconnected. This is a methodological question at the most fundamental level of social analysis. Historical materialism, as we know, frames the constitutive relations of historical change through the labor process. Everybody goes to class, but class is a result of the investigation of the labor process and its mediated relations, the socio-ecological relations of production and reproduction. In this perspective, theoretical differences are resolved on what Marx and Engels call the real ground of history. For instance, in my critique of Andreas Malm's Fossil Capital thesis, I offer an alternative historical explanation. This includes elements of Malm's analysis of resources, of class struggle in the mill towns. These are undoubtedly important elements. However, on their own, it is very much a one-sided perspective. What is necessary is to resolve the theoretical difference of the fossil capital thesis on the real ground of history to make sense of the rise of large-scale industry through not only the English textile industry, but also the plantation system, the plantation proletariat, and the role of cheap nature in the rise of large-scale industry. Marx says this very directly in Theories of Surplus Value. And I don't say that because Marx was correct about everything. I say this because there is a sectarian approach to Marx and Marxism that has floated through and I think stultified much ecological Marxist thought and its connection to everyday socialist strategy and the socialist politics of climate change. Moreover, what Marx and Engels allow us to do is to understand that bourgeois ideology is a real material force in the making of the modern world. And I'll talk quite a bit about that over the next 45 minutes. This includes today the academic world and even many or most of its so-called critical intellectuals who wish to avoid the conversation about class and capital at every conceivable turning point. That itself is a historical phenomena of the cultural Cold War and the neoliberal counter-revolution. For world ecology, the only difference that matters is historical. So our abstractions, the concepts we use in this approach, follow Marx in identifying real abstractions, that's Sohn Redl's phrase, that are, for instance, value, but they are also the ruling ideas or ruling abstractions of man nature, and civilization. I use the antiquated English form of these terms because it is crucial to remember that none of these categories are innocent. All of these categories were developed during the rise of capitalism, through the process of primitive accumulation, through the dynamics of imperialism, as they actually existed. Man, nature, civilization, Europe, many of these concepts that we take for granted were, in fact, imperialist categories, inventions of the long 17th century. World ecology follows a Marxist approach in pursuing interpretive categories and developing concepts that are concrete historical abstractions, not thought abstractions. And so, in this perspective, and forgive me, that what we want to develop is what Marx surely would have agreed with Lukács in calling the point of view of totality, or even better, as I have argued recently, the proletarian standpoint in the web of life. Now, that will sound antiquated to many people, and I want to suggest that the reason it sounds antiquated is because of the ideological triumph of the imperialist bourgeoisie over the past 50 years. If history had gone a different way, we would not see it as antiquated. This is also why people think Anthropocene is an acceptable term and Capitalocene, age of capital, is not. So in contrast to mainstream and critical theory, we in world ecology do not hide the class basis of our perspective. This is not, emphatically not, a matter of politics determining theory and method. There is a dialectic. The proletarian standpoint, because it embodies the tendency towards communism as the abolition of class society, not as a future state of affairs, Marx and Engels underlined, the proletarian standpoint is the most universalist of all intellectual tendencies, dialectical universalism, in stark contrast to the fraudulent character of bourgeois universalism. And in this approach, we strive in any event to avoid the sectarianism that is commonplace in the academic world. It is certainly not limited to Marxists. Everybody in the academic world seemingly wants to defend their position by destroying others' insights. But of course, in world ecology, we borrow deeply and promiscuously from insights across the bourgeois natural and social sciences, from professional class critical theory, and we praise them often, and we praise other Marxists with whom we disagree. And these are crucial interventions: fossil capital, degrowth communism, metabolic rift thinking. These are crucial contradictions to a potentially revolutionary synthesis. However, that synthesis is impossible to realize without the kinds of comradely dialogue that not just in world ecology, but in world ecology and a few, and I emphasize a few other tendencies within eco-socialist, Marxist, and radical thought have embraced. So in this approach, we accept neither the positivist universalism of mainstream theory, think of neoclassical economics, or the inverse, the causal pluralism, the critical theory of assemblage, network approaches, etc., which express distinctive yet compatible class standpoints. We do not share the class formalism of ecological Marxists or the nature society reductionism of those Marxists. And I will explain why, both theoretically, but also more importantly, historically. And let's just remember that from Marx and Engels' perspective, theoretical differences are resolved on the real ground of history, on actual turning points, the debate over the character of patterns in class society in the history of capitalism, cycles of imperialism, cycles of expansion and contraction, the particular class and technical dynamics that allow for a transition from one phase of capitalism to another, from the competitive industrial capitalism of British led capitalism in the 19th century to the rise of monopoly capitalism, for instance. We must explain those, and that explanation, that task of explanation and interpretation on the real ground of history is what matters. Why? Well, for Marx, and I think this is the great insight about the philosophy of praxis, as Gramsci liked to say, trying to elude the censors. If we take the philosophy of praxis seriously, praxis has, of course, a philosophical moment which insists on two halves, if you will, of a dialectic of praxis. One, of course, is in the present, where we reevaluate strategy in the light of success and failure from week to week, month to month, year to year. The other crucial moment is the real ground of history. The philosophy of praxis mandates that we study with relentless curiosity the actually existing concrete historical transformations of capitalism as a whole, but also crucial transitions within national capitalist formations. Why, for instance, do we see the emergence of modern Italy and modern Germany almost in the same decade at that moment? Well, in order to develop our theory, we must investigate transitions, large and small, in between at every point. Now, here's what's often misunderstood about Marx and class and production, that this is a conception of modes of production, of class dynamics as fundamentally unfolding within and with other webs of life. Marx and Engels repeatedly insist that human labor is itself a specifically harnessed natural force, a term Marx uses in the Grundrisse. At the very beginning of their conception of historical materialism, the first lines of part one of the German ideology are about how labor and webs of life fit together, and the history of class society and the history of modes of life must be told through natural conditions and their subsequent modification through the labor process. Therefore, the German ideology was the reason why they make this critique is, well, for many reasons, but fundamental is the problem of what later became known as the Malthusian problem of abstract man against abstract nature. In the specific context of 1840s Germany, they were responding to Feuerbach and the young Hegelians, who were idealists. And their point of departure was abstract man against abstract nature. Marx and Engels said, no, it's the labor process in the web of life. Of course, that's my summary, and I encourage you to read and make up your own mind. Eco-socialists today, and even most so-called orthodox Marxists, have completely forgotten this critique, that Marx and Engels begin not with man and nature, which was Marx's object of critique as well in the 1844 manuscripts. They begin with the labor process in the web of life. And the labor process includes the human and the extra-human, and it unifies in their conception in a distinctive and differentiated unity, production and intergenerational reproduction, what they call the creation of fresh life in procreation. So it is simply not true that Marx practiced a labor reductionism, that it only had to do with wage labor, that it excluded questions of social reproduction. This is emphatically false, and it is a position that is sustained by ignoring what they actually wrote about. So fundamental to this epistemological and ontological perspective on history and class struggle is a theory of the revolutionary tasks of knowledge. And Marx says again and again that we must strive towards what one might call a communist or proletarian science. Again, those are terms that ring in our ears in a very, very funny way because of anti-communist ideology. But he says this again and again from the very beginning of his thinking and his work with Friedrich Engels. We know only a single science, the science of history, that combines the science of man and the science of nature again and again and again. This is, I think, the totally forgotten element of Wallerstein's important intervention. Wallerstein, for a half century, insisted that world systems analysis was not about systems. It was about a mode of thought that would unthink the violence, the intellectual violence, the ideological violence of bourgeois knowledge carved up into a science of man against the science of nature and different disciplinary structures which exist, after all, to discipline intellectuals. And therefore, the intellectuals will then go and discipline everyone else. We should remember Noam Chomsky's famous observation that the more educated you are, the more indoctrinated you are. The intellectual classes have, with very few exceptions, generally favored the powerful. And that has a real material history to it. I want to walk through, and I won't read every slide here. I simply provide them to give you a few glimpses into the thinking. In what follows, there is an engagement with metabolism, which, thanks to John Bellamy Foster's groundbreaking concept 25 years ago, he introduces the metabolic rift as a way to begin a project of synthesis. Now, as I've said, it was a brilliant concept, and Foster, for whatever reason, decided to stop the project of synthesis and make it into an orthodoxy. World ecology has many weaknesses, but we are not an orthodoxy. We are heterodox, and we encourage everyone in our conversation to be heterodox in ways that make political and intellectual sense to them. The short version of this argument is that I think Foster's original formulation spoke to, and I highlight this because world ecology pushes the synthesis forward. We, in fact, say that metabolism is fundamentally a labor concept, a labor process that mixes human labor relations with the rest of life. And that poses very difficult challenges for Marxist thought, because while labor relations are dialectical in many ways, the dynamics of the web of life are not dialectical. And so we can look at the history of volcanic activity. We can look at the history of solar fluctuations, both of which radically influence climate conditions and indeed have shaped decisively the history of capitalism. And understand that for Marx and Engels, dialectics is not an ontology. It does not say that asteroids strike the earth because of dialectics. And sometimes maybe Engels went a little bit in that direction, but I think he would agree with what I am saying too. That there is a mix of dialectical and non-dialectical processes at work in any historical moment. So, as I often like to say, one cannot tell the story of class society and civilization or the history of capitalism without a history of volcanic activity. Now, volcanic activity is not destiny. How modes of production and how different classes respond to the climate changes that result from volcanic activity is a matter of the class struggle, of politics, of the conjuncture. And we in our thinking, this has to be central as we head into a moment of epical climate class crisis. And this is another example of how world ecology brings together theory, method, and history. It says that the climate class nexus is fundamental to understanding major fundamental shifts in world history. The crisis of feudalism was one such outcome in which the ruling classes of Western Europe were dealt a historic defeat by the peasants and the urban working classes in the 14th and 15th centuries. We get capitalism because there is a drive on the part of aristocrats, kings, bankers, soldiers to fix the problem, that is the problem of declining seigneurial revenues that resulted from their defeat, the elite's defeat, in the class struggles of a climate moment of the Little Ice Age. This is very important to keep in our minds because we are confronted today with an argument of climate determinism that has a left-wing and right-wing expression. It is captured in the political discourse of a climate emergency, which is directly related to historic elite programs of state of emergency. And we all know this has been terrible, but nevertheless, we accept it because we have not learned how to put together climate as partly a dialectical process today, because it is the result of the accumulation of greenhouse gases and the capitalist enclosure of the atmosphere. But it is also partly non-dialectical, that it operates according to a long-standing biospheric and climate structure, which responds to the overaccumulation of greenhouse gases in different ways. Plus, as we are learning, the Hunga Tonga eruption, an undersea volcanic eruption in the South Pacific 3 years ago, I believe, in 2022, has had a significant impact on climate. At first cooling, and now it seems warming. That's a non-dialectical problem within a dialectical process of capitalism. So this might give you, as I call it with my students, I say this is an ice cream headache problem. You know, if you eat the ice cream too fast, it's very sweet, and we eat it fast because it's sweet, but it also gives us a headache, and that's okay. We want to have very nimble, flexible, yet historically grounded theories of the present that are also histories, a world history of the present, in order to make sense of the weak links in the imperialist chains of power. If we don't do this, what's at stake? Well, I think actually we've seen in eco-Marxist and eco-socialist thought over the past 2 decades, especially, an acceptance of limits to growth thinking. And I won't go into the whole history of limits to growth thinking. It goes specifically to 1972's book of that title by Donella Meadows and her team. It was financed by the Club of Rome and by the Volkswagen Foundation on the basis of an intellectual model developed by a fellow named Jay Forrester at MIT. And there's a very rich history that I could tell, but to make a long story short, it was part of an imperialist project to justify and impose austerity and counter-revolution on the Third World. Specifically, it was part of a larger effort led by the American Empire and by the trilateralists and other transnational networks of capitalists to undermine and sabotage what was then called the New International Economic Order. And already the counter-revolution in the global South was in play, as we know, certainly from the Indonesian coup in 1965 onwards, eventually culminating in the near total destruction of the world left virtually everywhere. And why am I saying this history? I am saying this history because the ideas of the present, of Anthropocene, of planetary stewardship, of nature positive, and many other slogans that are now emerging out of the billionaire foundations and the big networks like Davos, the Club of Rome. Yes, the Club of Rome still exists. The Trilateralists, the Bilderberg Group, a consortium of globalist North Atlantic capitalists. They are very, very much interested in narrating an ideology of climate austerity that seeks to respond to the climate crisis by balancing the costs of mitigation and adaptation on the backs and bellies of the bottom 80%. This is very clear as day if you look at their actual pronouncements. If you read what the ruling class is planning to do, they will tell you exactly what they are planning to do. As Jorgen Randers of Limits to Growth fame said in a 2012 report for the Club of Rome, we must have less democracy, as if the whole period of the past 50 years has not been a relentless attack on popular democracy of every kind. This is the world in which the bourgeois environmentalists inhabit and to which world ecology responds. However, it's also a critique of eco-Marxism, which has refused to engage the history of actually existing environmentalism. And that's a real problem, because once we start to look at the history of not just the ideas of environmentalism, but also the actual political practice of mainstream environmentalism, not the working class struggles of Naples in the 70s and 80s, but the environmentalism of the rich, as Martina Zalier likes to say. Once we begin to look at that history, we can begin to understand that many of the ideas we carry with us are, in fact, deeply supportive of the ruling class. And this is nowhere more in evidence than in the insistence that we live in a world shaped by the Malthusian conflict. I call it the eternal conflict because that's what they say, the eternal conflict between man and nature. This is the Anthropocene, with slogans like, "Are humans overwhelming the great forces of nature?" So part of what world ecology tries to do is to ask you to take seriously the critique of somebody like Pierre Bourdieu, not a Marxist, but Bourdieu, in his critique, his reflexive critique of ideology, gives us something that most of us don't want to do because it's very uncomfortable. And Bourdieu says something very straightforward. He says that a reflexive critique demands that we, as an individual, a researcher, thinker, that we look at the ways that our dominant models of thought as individuals correspond with the dominant models of thought in society. So if we are using man versus nature as our framework, and then moving to class analysis, or then moving to some other form of social analysis, we are embodying the mode of thought of the bourgeoisie. And that's not a matter of guilt or anything like that. It means that we must relentlessly interrogate our own premises. And as we know, most scholars do not want to question their thinking. They do not want to reinvent how they think about the world. They want to continue to perform their work in what 60s radicals called the knowledge factory. There are a few of us, and I think many of us in this room for sure, who want to practice intellectual disobedience. We want to confront the disciplines. We want to understand that academic business as usual is a fundamental part of the problem of the crisis of capitalism, the climate crisis, and the dynamics of our times. That the universities are full of many good people. The universities are also part of a wider, deeper ideological state imperial apparatus. And that's just a fact. That's not fanciful. And the point of most academia is to train postgraduate students to behave in acceptable ways and to say acceptable critiques, not to challenge the ideology that shapes all of our lives, and that is very dangerous because it is not merely ideology. It determines who gets jobs. It determines who receives funding. It determines the acceptable bounds of acceptable research. So go float a big proposal to the European Union, the European Research Fund, any of these big dynamics, and talk about the capitalist scene and the class struggle, and they will laugh you. They will throw your application into the rubbish bin without delay. And these are big issues that come up for anyone who wants to pursue a popular, democratic, in my view, a socialist alternative moving forward. And I'm not going to be able to get to everything that I wanted to today, but perhaps there will be other lectures for other days. And I just want to run through a few misconceptions about what world ecology does. It's very, very unusual to see a major Marxist perspective denounced by other Marxists and denounced by critical and liberal tendencies as well. And I think that's because world ecology is doing something that is very uncomfortable to everyone. The intellectual, generally speaking, the intellectual does not want to unthink his or her basic categories. I often remark, and this, I know we have many people in cultural studies and literary analysis. I often confess that I am a recovering vulgar materialist. And what world ecology has done is to bring the insights of the critique of ideology, of cultural materialism, the history and critique of bourgeois science into the center of our thinking, and therefore into the center of our political questions of praxis for the socialist movement, what remains of the socialist forces today. And this is a way of beginning to unthink and rethink. So we do not, for instance, jettison class, we embrace class, but it is not the class formalism of the Second International, which has now made a comeback with people like Andreas Malm, with people like Matt Huber, who talk about class in an economic reductionist way. We give an anti-imperialist and feminist reading of the class struggle in the web of life, that this indeed is the dynamic of capitalism and its specific form of endless capital accumulation, always with and within webs of life. And so for us, there is a fundamental critique of ideology that asks intellectuals to unthink their categories of man, nature, and civilization. And today we know that there are some who are willing to do a part of that. So they are willing to talk about decolonizing this or that, but they don't want to go to the decolonial struggles of Lenin or Mao or Castro or Fanon even. They invoke Fanon, but they don't want to take the class critique seriously. Fanon was our greatest critic of bourgeois nationalism, and yet the way that he is rehabilitated is to make him into a kind of bourgeois nationalist. This is part of the historical, cultural critique that world ecology carries forth, of course, always joined to specific historical explanations. So if you read what I write and you like it or you hate it, you will always think, well, there was history there and I learned something. If you don't learn something about history by reading what I have written, you are not really reading what I have written. And yet the way that the discourse has been carried on has been quite destructive and quite the opposite of the ways that Marx and Lenin and many other people carried forth their critiques, which is a critique and dialogue on the real ground of history. Instead of, for instance, my comrade Andreas Malm debating with me the origins and conditions of the rise of large-scale industry, the industrial capitalist, all he can do is call me names and say that I'm a Latourian. Now, it seems to me that Latour had some good things to say. It also seems to me that anyone who would call me that understands neither Latour nor Moore. And that's symptomatic of a broader pathology in intellectual life today. Instead of addressing real historical differences, whether they are well known and world historical or whether they are very specific to your research field, debating the historical differences, that is, doing theory on the real ground of history, allows us to do something different and something deeply, deeply relevant to producing a usable knowledge for a revolutionary popular democratic movement. And if we don't know that history, then we will be controlled by it. There is a wonderful French expression about politics that I always paraphrase for world history, and it's basically this. You might ignore world history, but world history will never ignore you. This has huge implications for what we're doing. I also just want to add, before I go to a conclusion, world ecology is not a macro theory. It is not a systemic theory. And believe it or not, it doesn't come out of world systems analysis. Now, Wallerstein said many, many great things, and I've praised him at many points. The core, and this is the core point, and this is important whether you are an ethnographer working in a specific village or town for many, many months or years, as it is if you are studying the dynamics of national literatures or world historical economic transformations, that everything flows through labor, not in a reductive way, but it flows through a labor process in the web of life. There's nothing that is outside, in the human experience, outside the world of labor. And my perspective and my arguments about world ecology try to begin and end with that sensibility. My own strategic influences, people often ask me, are of course Marx on the labor process. And if you want the most gratifying 5 minutes, intellectually 5 minutes of your life, go read the first page of Marx's chapter on large scale, on the labor process and the valorization process, or something to that effect. For the English edition, the vintage Penguin edition, it's page 283 if you want. And what does Marx say? He says that labor is the dynamic of human nature and the rest of life, he calls it external nature, that activates new potentialities. That's obviously been a discovery of capitalism and the bourgeoisie's drive to control labor. That is also the insight of the communist imaginary, that it is through the labor process and through the cooperation, he says very specifically, cooperation, that new potentialities slumbering within the human species can emerge. And that's a dialectical principle of emergence or of becoming. I fear that that active moment of materialism has been largely lost or disregarded, even by many eco-Marxists. And that's important. We can evaluate the history of actually existing socialism any way that we want, but we should take the new wave of history, the post-Cold War wave of history, very seriously to see its accomplishments as well as its problems. But one thing that every great socialist project attempted was a true mass mobilization of the human spirit, of human solidarity, of human imagination and collectivity to build socialism. This was Cuba's 10 million ton Zafra project. Yes, in empirical terms, it failed, but as a solidarity making project, it succeeded. It was the Soviet Union in the 1930s. It was China in the 1950s. And these are for sure contradictory human experiences, but every major national liberation and socialist project in the 20th century was distinguished by its willingness to liberate, to activate new potentialities slumbering within humankind, to activate a spirit of creativity, of solidarity, that was capable of extraordinary achievements. And like I said, we don't need to be naive about this, but neither should we succumb to the Cold War anti-communist caricature. So to sum up, I think that so often we, especially if we are in the academy, if we are for postgraduate students, especially, but not only, it starts in undergraduate, in the undergraduate years, we are taught, well, here's theory over here. And then here's another question, it's method. And then here's another question that's history. And we are indoctrinated. We are brainwashed by a kind of totalitarian logic in the knowledge factory to think of these questions as separate. And in fact, we know they are the most intimately tied questions. And they're intimately tied not only in our individual intellectual procedures, but those procedures themselves are soaked through with the violence of bourgeois ideology that is laundered. I don't know if this, like you've heard of money laundering, that are laundered by academic procedures, academic institutions, academic orthodoxies that produce then fragments. They produce fragmented knowledge that is a design of the system, because the last thing the bourgeoisie wants is for intellectuals to get out of hand. And this was a huge concern. I mentioned the origins of mainstream environmentalism in the late 1960s and 70s. In the early 1970s, this was a huge concern on the part of ruling classes. They said it out loud. In 1975, the Trilateralist Commission published a book called The Crisis of Democracy, written by Samuel P. Huntington, who's also famous for the Clash of Civilizations thesis. He was a horrible, evil human being. And when he wrote The Crisis of Democracy, he meant there was too much democracy. And specifically, he thought there were too many values-oriented, that was the term he used, too many values-oriented intellectuals who were raising dangerous questions about capitalism. And one of the lessons that the North Atlantic ruling class drew out of this experience is that intellectuals should never again be allowed to get out of control. They should never again be allowed to become dangerous. And guess what? They got their wish. Now it's up to us to decide if we want to push back and we want to begin to create liberatory, emancipatory zones, not in some sloganeering way, but in a real, concrete knowledge movement that is tied directly to the priorities of movements for popular democratization. And to do that, we need to go back to those two moments of praxis: the present and the history. And the history is not past. We're taught that history is about the past. History is not past. We live in a moment. This is what Lukács said. It's what Paul Sweezy said. We live in the present as a historical moment. And that's true whether you are studying something that occurred 5 years ago, 50 years ago, or 500 years ago. It is relevant whether your geographical unit of study is capitalism as a whole or is a particular village, in the countryside of Barcelona. These dynamics are part of how we come to grips with capitalism, which is the most totalizing, and I would say the most totalitarian system ever devised. How do we begin? Well, one place of entry for intellectuals is to return to the proletarian standpoint, to understand the point of view of totality, and to fully embrace in every conceivable way the real ground of history, including the present as a world historical moment. Thank you very much.
As always, great, Jesus. Okay, many thanks. For I have some notes. Can you imagine? But people that are participating in our webinar, if they want, can they write in Zoom chat some comments or questions for Jason. Jason can read them in the same chat to answer people. But waiting for some questions, Jason, I have two questions for you. The first one is about. Well, I think that in the world ecology conversation there is a very important link between imperialism and labor. We can understand this relationship in your speech now, but if we read your articles about Madeira, about Potosi, the so-called Potosi moment, we read that imperialism, colonialism are fundamental to manage, to organize not only human labor, but human labor, nature, no, not human labor, no? And so the first question is about the role of colonialism and colonies in the world ecology. And it's fundamental to understand what you say when you say that history is not the past. Because if we think to Gaza moment, if we see to Gaza, and maybe Gaza now is Gaza moment, as was Potosi moment. We see that imperialism, labor, and colonialism are very linked and are not part of the past. And so the first question is about the relationship between imperialism, labor, and colonialism. Okay. The other question is about you spoke about climate austerity. Well, my question is about what you think the relationship between climate austerity and ongoing increasing war regime. In my opinion, we are living in a war regime. Yes, it's so clear from the standpoint of Gaza or Sudan and other countries, but also in our, well, for example, in Italy, we have a problem. We have a reduction of democracy, also in the university. So my question is about what if you think there is a relationship between climate austerity and the increasing war regime in our time now.
Right. Well,
so I have two questions. And then there is a question, sure, by Alexander, and another by, I think, Sergio, but Jesus or Miguel Angel can help us. Okay.
Should I start with your two questions then, or?
Okay.
Or, oh, I see. Let me answer first your two questions, Gennaro, and then Marco and Alexander's. First, you are absolutely correct. There is a drive towards world war. I have already called the U.S., NATO, Russia war in Ukraine as the beginning of World War III. Perhaps we could begin even earlier. It is instructive to remember And eco-socialists never talk about this. They
Jason.
never mention. Yes. It is important to remember that the United States has organized approximately 500 military interventions overseas since 1776. 1/3 of those, so approximately 170, have occurred since 1999. I think that's a classic point. That's a classic data point that suggests that capitalism has entered into a new era of wars of redivision, as Lenin said before 1914, and that the climate crisis is part of it. Now, the camp of Beijing and the camp of Washington have very different approaches to the climate crisis. They both envision a post-capitalist world. They both envision a model of political accumulation, that is, one in which politics would be in charge. I don't think this is techno-feudalism, but the spirit of the argument is essentially the same. We can debate particulars that are important, but they both imagine political accumulation. But the Chinese model is more egalitarian and less bellicose, less warlike, more respectful of difference than the American model. And this is, above all, when we talk about the American model, that is very much in question right now because, believe it or not, with considerable unevenness, the Trump approach is to essentially vandalize, as my friend Christian Parenti says, to vandalize the post-Cold War order and to upset the neoconservative unipolar approach of Bush 2, of Clinton 1, of Clinton, Bush, Obama, and then Biden, who were driving us to the very, very brink of nuclear war. And that's not my opinion. That's the opinion of the Union of Concerned Scientists, who first started keeping track of the doomsday clock in 1947. So that's absolutely crucial. The left is basically powerless these days, intellectually unwilling to deal with this dynamic and to understand the new war of redivision that is unfolding between the camp of Washington and the camp of Beijing, with climate change part of that dynamic. So much of what I say about climate austerity and a kind of scientific dictatorship emerging out of the imperial West is a project. It should not be understood as a done deal, but is the basic logic of the North Atlantic ruling class from the 1970s has been to use environmentalism and environmental themes to push back the third world. And there's a long and complex story to this that we can get into, but that's central to a series of essays that I published in recent years and to my new book. We are indeed in a Gaza moment. People say, well, that's not about labor. Yeah, absolutely, it's about labor. The fact is that Israel's imperialist advances became much more ruthless the moment that they secured enough cheap Russian and Eastern European labor in the 90s, and you can see the turn directly. So yeah, of course, there is the scorched earth genocidal practices of the imperialist state, which even its own members describe as fascist, by the way. That's not my characterization. I think that's Ben-Gvir's self-description. And that they want to clear that to make more room for their cheap labor regime. So what is colonialism and what is imperialism? Colonialism was the formal administrative structure of imperialism until basically World War II. And colonialism was, as I talk about in colonial Peru and many other places around the world, the way that the imperial bourgeoisie wanted to organize the class struggle. They wanted to wage the class struggle to secure cheap labor, cheap food, cheap energy, cheap land, cheap resources, cheap everything. They used the formal administrative power and military power of the colonial state to secure the cheap conditions of accumulation. After World War II, colonialism rebranded to development and developmentalism. This was Truman's famous Point 4 inaugural address in 1949. And by the way, that extends to sustainable development, which was very much a ruling class project developed by an alliance of capitalists, but in which the petrocapitalism was central. Gro Brundtland was, of course, the prime minister of a petro state. The Stockholm Conference on the Environment in 1972 was organized by an oil executive. That tells us something about the ideology and the interests at stake in mainstream environmentalism. So imperialism, of course, continues, but there is a new dynamic that is bringing back the conditions of the pre-World War I moment. And I think we should take that seriously. Okay, now we have questions.
Yes, we have. Yeah, no, I don't know if you can read the chat, but for example, I can
Yes,
post
yes,
the
I see.
questions.
So,
So the questions are how do you say grabadas, no? Picked up by the recording. Okay. So one question is from Marco Colacino. Can the indigenous Wemvivir become a way to escape from the eco-suicide that capitalism is building up? That's one question that is related with another. Alexander Panes says, hi, I have a question. How does the world ecology perspective interact with the struggles like those emerging from peasants and indigenous peoples in the global south, their forms of struggle and their knowledge of the current crisis?
right.
Two questions that you can perhaps
I think I
answer.
can answer them very, very concisely. It seems to me that Buenvivir and the politics around that have many great insights. I'm not convinced that I'm not convinced that it's an effective politics if we mean that we are taking their specific advocacy, which is very much internalized, a lot of anti-communist neoliberal ideology. And I've had this exchange with Gudinas, who I see as a deeply inspiring figure in some ways, and also a very deeply problematic figure. He's staunchly anti-communist, staunchly anti-Marxist. And this is very common for amongst a certain strain of decolonial thought. I've written on this quite at some length with people like Walter Mignolo, who represent a kind of neoliberal imperial appropriation of decolonial thought. And I will say, The Darker Side of the Renaissance is a great book. All right, so I'm not saying that these people don't have good things to say. That in my view, there are, to Alexander's questions, and please forgive me because you might not like my answer on this. I think that for the most part, what we call peasants across the global south are semi-proletarian populations that are reproduce themselves, yes, in part through access to subsistence, part lifetime subsistence, non-cash forms of social reproduction, and then wage labor through the precariat and formalization, migration, et cetera. So I don't think that those are peasantries, at least not in the way that we speak of peasantries in the early 20th century, in previous centuries of development. I think that most so-called peasantries are, in fact, populations of agrarian classes of labor, as Henry Bernstein says. Nevertheless, I think we can glean many crucial insights. And again, my question is, what are the actual politics? I think a lot of times politics is sidestepped, and there's a kind of diffuse, call it horizontalism, call it something else, that has been an absolute and total politics of failure. Now, can we take good insights from them? Yes, absolutely, 100%. But without a political strategy to gain state power and then to defend it, there will be no meaningful change that benefits the vast majority. And it's not going to be done by incremental, by a form, basically a lot of these escapist politics, and you see it across the Latin America, you see it across many parts of the world, they're escapist politics, and I don't mean to discredit them. They're not They're often very courageous, but they want to somehow escape from the contradictions of capitalism. And that's dangerous if there is no escape. That, yes, if you're sitting on a piece of land that's not economically valuable, you might be able to escape for a while. But if you're sitting on a piece of land that has valuable minerals, that has valuable oil, that has something that the imperialists want, they are going to come for you. They're going to come for you with the drones, with the death squads, with the special forces. And let's not fool ourselves in the imperialist West. As Comrade Gennaro knows, I could simply mention the words Moro affair, and we would begin to understand the way in which the imperialist West established secret armies under Operation Gladio to murder labor leaders and community organizers and everyone else. This is a story that has been told in the imperialist West again and again and again. This is the problematic of what's variously called the national security state or the deep state. And most academics on the left just pretend that's not a reality. So we need a politics in the present moment. The conflicts are going to deepen. And we need a politics capable of that. Can indigenous perspectives help us? Yes, absolutely. So I'm not dismissing that. I'm simply saying that a politics that goes under the heading of indigenism is itself a form of woke bourgeois nationalism. And that's going to be insufficient.
Thank you, Jason. Two more questions. Juan Altuna asks, which countries would you say are advanced in the treatment and critique of imperialist intellectual categories? And another question, how can intellectuals deal today with the increasingly frequent closures and rigidities of academia and claim greatest independence in the intellectual terms? I'm of the world, I have the impression that there is always more attention to avoiding dealing with scientific topics that are considered uncomfortable or excessively critical towards the dominant ideology regarding both the climate crisis but also current economic models. This question is from Ricardo Ardovini.
Jesus, there is also a question by from Sergio, the first one. Sergio wrote, yes, the first question. Sergio wrote, I have a question, how to identify if the Anthropocene is being used as a slogan-like concept and how to use it in a more critical way. It's impossible.
Thank you, comrade. Yes. First of all, we want to recognize that the Anthropocene, which is coined more or less in 1999, I'm sorry, Crutzen and Sturmer, and then Crutzen began to popularize it just 1 or 2 years later. It's completely unoriginal. And indeed, Soviet scientists had, in the 1920s, had a term that was something like Anthropozoic. And in the, but here's the other thing. It's completely unoriginal. The Holocene concept already includes everything that the Anthropocene talks about. So why did the Anthropocene become so popular? Because it was well funded, because there was institutional power behind it, because it is unthreatening to the ruling class, because it can appear in The Guardian and other comparable liberal media outlets to talk about how climate change is human caused. It is an ideological project. Now, do some scientists frame their work within the Anthropocene, and do they perform useful work? Yes, of course. But ideologically, we have to understand that it was invented as part of a neoliberal ideological project. And I don't make this is it is straight up neo-Malthusian. And I'm not speculating when I say this. I'm not calling it a name. For instance, the term human enterprise is used by Will Steffen and his colleagues again and again and again in talking about the Anthropocene. You know where the term human enterprise comes from? It comes from Paul and Anne Ehrlich, the original architects of 1968 neo-Malthusian environmentalism from the population bomb. So that's my short way of saying man and nature thinking can never be made more critical. You can dress it up as more critical, but then it in fact performs its ideological work more successfully. Are there situations, if you are a postgraduate student or a young, a new lecturer, where you must use that language because you're being compelled? Yes. Remember Gramsci in prison. He must write the philosophy of praxis. He can't write Marxism. He can't write the proletarian standpoint. He must write it in code. And radicals always have to work in code under conditions of censorship to one degree or another. Now, for Miguel from Wana Azuna, are there countries, are there places where the critique of imperialism is more advanced? Definitely. Compare Southern Europe to Northern Europe. When I go to Britain, when I go to Germany, when I go to Canada and to places around the United States, they don't want to hear about imperialism. They might tolerate some discussion of colonialism, and they always modify it. So they say something like settler colonialism, because what they're saying is we're not really talking about imperialism. Sometimes they are. There are a few Marxists who do, yes, but in terms of the academic culture, they don't want to talk about imperialism. The more, and of course, when I go to Latin America, then they are much more receptive. When I go to Ireland, they will listen to me about imperialism. But other places, imperialism has dropped out. Within ecological Marxism, look at some of the leading lights today of ecological Marxism. There is Saito, there is Malm, there is Foster, and their ecological theories have very little to say about imperialism. Foster, in other contexts, is definitely anti-imperialist, and that's my point. You have Jason Hickel, who is he's not teaching in Britain anymore, and he has adopted an increasingly militant anti-imperialist line. So I think that's the major divide within eco-socialist struggles, within degrowth movements, within all sorts of environmental politics, that we must develop an anti-imperialist critique that is also a class critique in the web of life. And that is a major task of the theoretical struggle, as Lenin would say. And then to Ricardo's great question, basically it's how do we survive in the academy, in academia? That's how I read it. Don't get me wrong about Trump in the US over the past few months. That's been awful. That's been horrible. But as ever, Trump did not start this. It was centrist liberals who started this, going back to Obama's Dear Colleague letter, which is an Americanism for finding ways to discipline the universities to pursue a human resources employment management strategy called DEI. DEI is not what you think it is. It is a management strategy. And the destruction of American universities has occurred under the watch, not of Republicans, but of centrist liberals. And that's, I'm not sure what that tells us about your questions, of how academics survive. I think we need to view ourselves as workers in a knowledge factory, and factories aren't bad. We need to find ways to liberate the knowledge factory. For now, we must find our comrades, build our relations of solidarity, of mutual support. We must find those who will encourage us to take risks, who will encourage us when we feel uncomfortable. And that's not easy to do. I think meetings like this, dialogues like this one, can play a role. But ultimately, again, we need a political strategy to gain power over the universities, over what Marx and Engels called the means of mental production. That is itself part of the proletarian struggle. And we have to become creative about how to pursue that. And there are more questions that have come. Maria, if it's okay, I think I can write. She says, hello, everyone. I am a PhD student at the University of Rome. In your book, Beyond Climate Justice, you talked about the human-nature dichotomy and how many subjects historically have been categorized as nature. That's very good. Oh, sorry, wait, now I've lost track of it. Sorry. Here. Okay, here we are. This also emphasizes the distinction between the industrial and developing countries, I would say imperialists and the colonies and neo-colonies. In your opinion, is the typical distinction between global north and global south, the Brandt line after the Brandt Commission report in 1978, which was a World Bank, by the way, that was an imperialist project. And is this still a sharp distinction or is it blurring? It's a fantastic question. I think global south and global north are terrible concepts. We sort of know what we mean, but emphatically, definitively, the rise of the BRICS, the rise of China, and Putin's reorganization of Russia as a military and economic superpower have put an end to that model. Now, one thing that Wallerstein gave us was a little bit of a way to say there is a core, there is a periphery, and there is a semi-periphery. And this was a heuristic, as he liked to say. It was not a formal theory. It was a heuristic. It was a heuristic to understand what, Wallerstein asked, flows of surplus value. It's interesting, when you read about Wallerstein, it's like system and core and periphery and this and that. But no, it was about the worldwide class struggle. It was about the flows of surplus value, and it was about the politics around it. So in answer to your question, Maria, the boundaries are being destabilized in a major way, and not just through China, India, and the BRICS, but also, as we've been learning, like Comrade Traore, a kind of bourgeois but militant nationalist in Upper Volta, who is, pursuing an anti-imperial strategy that is not yet a socialist strategy, but in the moment where there is now an effective counterweight to American empire in the form of the Sino-Russian bloc, then we might see more possibilities across the neo-colonies, and we might see more space. Indeed, as we're seeing across the Sahel. Very important question. And then Miguel asked about arts and literature. As I tried to mention, but couldn't say more, this is fundamental to what world ecology is. World ecology is seriously the critique of ideology, cultural materialism, including literary criticism in a cultural materialist way. One thinks of the work of Raymond Williams, of Terry Eagleton, and many others, as well as my enormously gifted comrades really across the world, but especially in the Spanish-speaking world, dealing with questions of literature, culture, power, ideology in the capitalist world ecology. I think one of the most exciting domains of world ecological thinking has been in literary and cultural studies. And this is fundamental. I often work with artists. I often will teach in museums of modern art and teach artists about the climate crisis. And I feel like I learn more than they do, or I learn as much as they do. And it is extraordinary that what we need in the moment to achieve the kinds of revolutionary consciousness necessary to address the climate crisis, we need revolutionary art in the best sense of that term. Revolutionary music, literature, painting, films, everything. And this is, the arts, of course, are also part of what is systematically devalued by the academy, and also systematically devalued even by most, I will say certainly most Marxist social scientists, who think that art and culture is epiphenomenal. And that is a profound mistake that we need to, world ecology wants to push back against that, wants to develop a coherent alternative that brings together the economist studying the falling rate of profit with the literary scholar studying Shakespeare's Tempest and the climate changes of the 16th and 17th centuries. That conversation is vital to both. And we are still disciplined. Our minds are alienated and fragmented by the violence of the bourgeois academy and its disciplines, which exist to discipline all of us.
So, Jason, is it true that the Open Ways of Latin America, written by Galeano, was fundamental for part of your elaboration? Is it true?
Galeano was, it's very sad that he later denounced the open veins of Latin America, and I still don't know why. The open veins of Latin America, for so many of us, was a fundamental element, a pillar of our anti-imperialist critique. And Galeano was so good that he understood what most Marxists did not, that imperialism was always about, as Marx says, the soil and the worker. And if you have not read The Open Veins of Latin America, please read it. He was, of course, a great poet and wrote it as a great poet. It was a book that could never be written in a university. And I think that's part of the tragedy of what the imperialist and bourgeois forces have achieved over the past 50 years, is they've destroyed the cultural spaces and the spaces of solidarity and public life that would sustain thinkers like Galeano. That is a foundational book. Please, if you have not read it, sit down. Any chapter is brilliant. My favorite is called King Sugar.
Okay. I agree. I read Galeano in my adolescence. It was fundamental. It was fundamental to begin to understand better the word that I didn't call word ecology, but
for me as well.
Yes,
for me as well. And it was for me, it was Galeano with Marx, with Emmanuel Wallerstein, his history of capitalism, and Fernand Braudel. And we need to put those sensibilities together. Some of those, Braudel is not a left-wing thinker by any stretch of the imagination. In fact, he was a creature of the Ford Foundation and the Cultural Cold War in France, and widely known as an Americanizer, which, as if there's anyone from France in the audience, you know how big an insult that was. But his ability to make sense of the empirical relations of labor and the land and environmental change and climate were absolutely fundamental. And this is why I worry about radical intellectuals today, that for too many radical intellectuals, they are first closed off and they go to a sectarian position. Sectarianism is not about disagreement. Sectarianism is about denouncing other comrades for perceived philosophical deviations, such that a difference in one's analysis of the French Revolution or the Russian Revolution then leads directly to a difference of political principle. So if you don't agree, this is to caricature, this is the famous Trotskyist sectarian move. If you don't agree with my interpretation about the Trotsky-Stalin split, you're a friend of the ruling class. And that's a bit of a cartoon, I realize, but you know what I mean. And what we want to do is we want to find the common ground. So recently, maybe a month ago, I wrote a very friendly letter to John Bellamy Foster, the editor of Monthly Review. And I said, John, here is a proposal. How about you and I cooperate on the 75% where we agree? And we can put off the discussion of the 25% where we disagree for another day. And I've made various overtures like that to many people over the years, to Andreas Malm and many others, and they will have none of it. this is very, very, very destructive, well beyond what some professors say at North American or North Atlantic universities, because it infects the culture of the academic left and the intellectual left. We need to find a way to cooperate where we agree. This was what Lenin was great at. I know that we're not supposed to talk about Lenin, but Lenin was very good on this. He was very good at building coalitions in the party, and he was often outvoted, by the way. So, and every great revolutionary must find a way to find those agreements, and then to carry forth the struggle on that basis. Later, maybe the agreement changes, but we have to find a way intellectually to do that, because there will come a time where the intellectual resources that we have to offer are increasingly relevant in an immediate and practical way to the broader democratic forces.
Yes, and I agree. You speak about, for the ecology, conversation. Conversation is part of a scientific and political method to also to have a wide and deep capacity to study, to understand in a world that also in the universities usually don't love this method and also this kind of categories of approaches. So we have to also to defend the spaces, no, yes, and to defend the spaces we need alliances. And okay, yes, I agree. Yeah, totally agree. Okay, I don't know if I think that, okay, Jason, if you agree and other people, we can stop here. We can thank you. And Jason, once again, confirm this generosity. Yes, as a scholar and activist, but
thank you.
But it's important that I say that to all people in this webinar that we recorded, and so I think that also for our research project we can share in the I don't know, in some social channel, in some internet web channels in the web in the next I think weeks, because I think we have to put in Spanish. I don't know about this, but many thanks, Jason. Jesus or Natalia or Miguel, please.
Okay, we feel very grateful for your presence, Jason. It has been a pleasure to hear you, to learn from you, and to share this webinar with you, and also with Gennaro, that has been a master of ceremonies. It's perfect.
The MC.
And
it's African Bambata.
we are very we are very grateful to the people that decided to join us, and we hope you enjoy, as we have enjoyed also, the presence of Jason. Jason, thank you so much. Very soon we will have the website of our project functioning, and then you will be online, so everybody can enjoy your talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ciao, Jason.
Ciao.